At a church in South London, as the service was closing, a stranger stood up in the back and asked the pastor if he could share his testimony. A few weeks ago, I was visiting a relative in Sydney, Australia, and was walking down George Street. A little white-haired man stepped outside of the doorway of a shop and asked me, "Excuse me, sir, are you saved? And if you died tonight, would you go to heaven?" I was astounded at his words. Nobody had ever asked me such a thing. All the way back to England on British Airways, I pondered his words. When called, a friend asked him about it. He was a Christian and led me to Christ. "I want to fellowship here with you." And everyone clapped at his conversion. That pastor flew to Adelaide, Australia the next week to speak at a conference at a church. A woman asked to speak with him, and before he would hear her story, he wanted to know if she had given her heart to Christ. She said, "I was visiting friends in Sydney and doing some last-minute shopping on George Street. A little white-haired man stepped outside of the doorway of a shop and asked me, 'Excuse me, madam, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven?' I was greatly disturbed by those words. When I got back to Adelaide, I came to this church and sought out the pastor, and he led me to Christ. Twice in 2 weeks he heard about this little man on George Street. He then flew to Perth to speak in a church. After the service, a leading member of the church took him out to eat, and he asked him how he came to Christ. I grew up in the church and never really followed Christ, but because of my business ability, I was given a place of influence in the church. I was on a business outing in Sydney, walking down George Street, and a little white-haired man stepped outside of the doorway of a shop and asked me, "Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven?" I was infuriated and told him I was an elder in the church. I flew home and told my pastor what had happened, thinking he would sympathize with me. The pastor told me he had been disturbed for years about my spiritual condition, and my pastor led me to Jesus. The pastor flew home to London and was speaking in a ministers' conference in Keswick and shared the story of the little white-haired man. 4 elderly pastors came up to him after the service and told him that they got saved between 25 and 30 years ago, respectively, through that little man on George Street. He next was speaking at a convention in the Caribbean to a group of missionaries from his denomination and shared the story about the little white-haired man. 3 missionaries came up to him and said, "We got saved through him 15 to 20 years ago, respectively." He continued on to Atlanta, Georgia, and spoke at a naval chaplains convention. After 3 days of speaking, the chaplain general took him out to a meal. He asked him how he gave his life to Christ. "When I was a young sailor, living a very sinful life, I was aboard a ship in the South Pacific, and we stopped in Sydney Harbor for replenishments. I got blind drunk, got on the wrong bus, and was dropped off on George Street. A little white-haired man stepped outside of the doorway of a shop and asked me, 'Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven?' The fear of God shook me. I was shocked sober and went back to the battleship, sought out the chaplain, and he led me to Christ. 6 months later, the pastor flew to India to do a convention for 5,000 Indian missionaries. The leader of the missionaries took him to his home to eat, and he asked him, "How did you as a Hindu come to Christ?" The leader responded, "I was in a very privileged position. I worked for the Indian diplomatic mission, and I traveled the world. I am so thankful for Jesus and the forgiveness of my sins. I would be very embarrassed if people knew how dark of a life I was living. I was in Sydney, Australia, doing some last-minute shopping, laden with gifts that I was bringing home to my wife and children. A little white-haired man stepped outside of the doorway of a shop and asked me, "Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven?" I was disturbed, and when I returned home, I sought out my Hindu priest. He told me to satisfy my curiosity to go and talk to the Christian missionary. That missionary led me to Christ. I abandoned Hinduism and soon began to study for ministry. I left the diplomatic mission and am today the head of these missionaries. We have led tens of thousands to Christ. 8 months later, he was speaking in Gamier, a southern suburb of Sydney, and he asked the pastor if he knew about a little man who witnessed on George Street. He said he did, and the man's name is Mr. Genour. He doesn't do it anymore as he is too old and frail. He asked if he could meet him, and 2 nights later they went to his apartment, and this frail little old man opened the door. He made them tea, and was so frail that he kept spilling his tea as his hand shook. The London preacher told him of all the accounts of the past few years. He began to cry and said, "My story goes like this. I was working on a warship, and at a time when my life fell apart, I went to a Christian man to whom I treated horribly. He led me to Christ, and my life changed from that day forward. I was so grateful to God that I would share Jesus with at least 10 people every day. I wasn't always able to do it. I wasn't paranoid about it, but did my best to fulfill my promise. I have done this for over 40 years, and in my retirement years, the best place was on George Street, as there are hundreds of people there. I got a lot of rejections, but a lot of people listened to me, and in 40 years of doing this, I have never heard of one person coming to Jesus from doing this, until today." The pastor told him he estimated 140,000 who had come to Christ through those he had influenced. 2 weeks later, Mr. Genour died. Can you imagine his reward when he got to heaven?